You're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast hosted by two women who never met in real life, but decided to start a podcast together despite barely knowing anything about each other and about podcasting.
Yeah.
But over time, if you listen to us since the beginning, then you got to know us basically at the same time as we got to know each other.
It's true. I have such a love-hate relationship with our first 30 episodes. The hardest thing is early on, we could hardly hear each other, and then our mics and things would cut out. So it took us a while to... Yeah, but...
Also, I was very deadpan in the beginning, I didn't like to joke.
No, and I was joking too much because I was nervous.
And then you always said, hello, can you hear me? And I'm like, yes. I'm just not laughing.
Also, that's how I learned that it's a very American thing to get to know somebody by sharing stories about your life. And that is not an Austrian thing at all. So I'd be like, yeah, this one time we did this vacation. And then normally someone would respond with, oh yeah, we whatever. And Johanna's just like crickets. It's like, oh man, she hates me.
You have to break the ice for us to share stories. That's the thing.
I get it. Yeah. Whereas I am an adult. I was diagnosed with adult ADHD while we were doing this podcast, but I'm sure it came to a surprise to no one. All right. So let's get into this. Before we begin, we really want to give a huge shout out to all of our Patreon members. You are supporting independent podcasting, and we just so appreciate you. Our newest patrons are Jenna Wise Hudek and Alex Fraser, who I think we might have mentioned before. I'm going to thank them again just in case. Thank you to Karen Garner, and a big thank you to one of our newest murder patrons, Bear Up. Thank you very, very much for your support.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. If you can't get enough of history that's equal parts horrifying and hilarious, we would love to have you join us over on Patreon. That's where we share all the extra good stuff. Early access, bonus content, our Cinema Macabre series, where Johanna and I pick apart true crime shows and spooky old movies, behind-the-scenes nonsense, and the occasional surprise gift in your actual mailbox.
We just started to discuss The Girlfriend, which is neither true crime nor old spooky movie, but oh my god, there's so much to talk about.
We can talk about whatever we want in Patreon. That's our special space.
That's
Things
true.
Don't have to be exactly on target with, Yeah. I love it, though. It's such a nice group of people. Also, your support helps keep the show going and growing because... listen, we've been doing this, is it 6 years? 6 years. We've been doing this for 6 years and 300 episodes. And we break even. And I think that if it wasn't for the community that we've sort of built around ourselves, I'm not sure that it would have made sense to keep going forward with this show.
No.
We're working on changing that. Keep your fingers crossed for us, please. But yeah, your support keeps the show going, and it just helps us bring you tales of vampires and murder and haunted ships and cursed jewelry and whatever other fresh hell we can dig up and share with you. Our patrons are the absolute best. We hang out together on
all of you
lives. Yeah. All of you, all of our listeners, our hellions are the best. In Patreon, we hang out together in live streams, swap Halloween stories. And if it sounds like your kind of crowd, come join us. You'll find all the details at patreon.com/FreshHellPodcast. For everything else, just listen to the end, because now this is an exceptionally long period of chattiness at the beginning for us. So let's get into this week's topic. We're still smack in the middle of Spooky Fuckery Month, and today's story has everything. Superstition, bureaucracy, blood, and that thing where Johanna says vampire about 50 times. So you're welcome.
I swear to God, I still can't hear the difference. And that was funny. Just last week, I saw a video of Arnold Schwarzenegger, because that's how he's called. That's his name. And he was talking about the exact same issue, all the problems he had when he came to the United States and started to learn English and work on his accent, which he did such an amazing job. You can't tell he's Austrian at all. No, but seriously, I felt seen because he explicitly got into the whole wine, and there's no difference for me there.
Yeah.
Anyway, today I want to present another history lesson from my beautiful home country of Austria, technically from the Habsburg Empire, which, by the way, is Habsburg, not Habsburg. So that's also kind of
Habsburg
that I don't understand.
With a B, not a P.
B.
Yeah,
like but in English, it's allowed to write it with a P, which was so irritating for me in the beginning and still is.
Well, I find it quite confusing because I've seen it so often with the P. And then I was like, oh no, it's been the B the whole time. Yes.
Anyway, let's not split hairs about any of this at all. The important part is villagers were convinced they had a vampire problem, and the Habsburg Monarchy did what it always did best. Let's just say reports were filed.
So many reports. We know there were Habsburger helpers, though, so that's been established.
That was one of the jokes you made in the beginning, and I was just like...
You had no... It came out of my mouth, Johanna. That pun came out of my mouth before I even recognized what was happening. And you had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, well, cut it if you want or leave it in. It could go either way. And it makes me laugh.
I was like, what are you even talking about?
I know.
All right, so we talked about vampires a few times before. We talked about the Highgate vampire, but also more general about vampire science. And in that episode, I'm pretty certain we talked about Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yes, I'm sure we did, right? I love this story because I'm more familiar with Mercy Brown and the local New England vampire panic, which has been on my list since we started the podcast, but it's never been really urgent because so many other podcasts have covered it and covered it well. That's kind of how I feel like that's part of my struggle with the Boston molasses flood. It's like, but so many of people have already talked about it. You don't really...
What else can we add?
Right. Yeah, sometimes it's like, yeah. But if like me, if you're like me, you maybe didn't know that the Austrians panicked first and they panicked hard. Like, wow. So in a way, I feel like it's good that I didn't cover Mercy Brown because this story is everything. We're getting there. Back to Dracula.
So, Dracula was first published in 1897, and I think by now it's common knowledge that the title character, so Count Dracula, was inspired by the 15th century Wallachian prince Vlad III Dracul, also known as Vlad the Impaler. But what about Dracula's famous adversary, Dr. Abraham van Helsing? Did Stoker base him on a historical figure as well? I have to say it's actually quite possible. Some experts believe that Stoker based him on Gerard van Swieten, who just happened to be the personal physician to Empress Maria Theresia of Austria. On paper, he was a Dutch court physician in Vienna, so not exactly your obvious choice for a vampire slayer, but van Swieten had one very particular line on his resume. He was famous for debunking vampire panics in the Habsburg borderlands. And that part really is true. The Empress' own doctor was dispatched to explain away the hysteria when terrified villagers insisted that the dead were rising, they were crawling out of their graves. And I know it all sounds ridiculous now, but when you remember how much fear and superstition thrived in especially rural areas back in the day, it makes absolute perfect sense that the Crown would want its top medical man on the case.
It actually does make sense for once. Like,
right?
Usually when we say, well, it makes perfect sense that this happened and we're being very tongue-in-cheek, but this actually makes sense and it's a delight. Thank you.
Especially when you know, and I'm getting into it, that bureaucracy is really one of the things we loved and still love here. So.
Yes.
All right. So in 1725, the Habsburg Empire was huge. It included, of course, Austria, but also Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, Croatia, Serbia, Romania. So it was a real patchwork of people and ethnicities and cultures and languages, and it was all ruled from Vienna. The borders shifted a lot, especially after the wars with the Ottoman Empire. So you had villages on the frontier that were technically Austrian, but culturally and religiously extremely mixed. And that is very important for our story today. Now imagine a summer evening in a small frontier village in 1725. You've just survived war and plague and famine and taxes that would crush anyone's spirit, and life is short and brutal and dictated by superstition just as much as faith. Death is never far from the doorstep. But what if death itself doesn't keep the dead where they belong? What if your recently buried neighbor or husband shows up at your window at night, demanding his shoes, and the next day you're dead?
Oh, not again. I hate it when that happens. Yeah. Nobody wants their dead neighbor showing up demanding their shoes. That's a problem on every level.
So many people don't even want their alive neighbors showing up at their doorstep unannounced.
That's right. Never mind my dead neighbor. Come on.
So yeah, but that's exactly what the villagers in the hamlet of Kisilova claimed in the summer of 1725. The man in question was one Petar Blagojević, and his death marked the beginning of one of the earliest and also best documented vampire panics in European history. It was so alarming that the Austrian authorities wrote an official report, and then that report was printed in Vienna, and then it was circulated across Europe, and for the first time the word vampire began to appear in German. That's, by the way, is Vampir. It's the German word. Then in French, and then it kind of went on to infiltrate the English language. And that, dear listeners, is how a dead man from a Serbian village under Habsburg rule helped unleash the vampire myth onto the Western world. Okay, but before we stake poor Petar through the heart, let's set the stage. Europe, early 1700s. The Ottoman wars had only recently pushed the Turkish armies out of Central Europe, but the borderlands still remained unstable. Villages were often destroyed and resettled. Soldiers moved in, moved out. Diseases spread quickly in the wake of famine and displacement. And the area around Kisilova, which is now in modern-day Serbia, was part of the military frontier. It was kind of a buffer zone under Austrian military administration. That meant that when strange deaths began occurring, it wasn't the local priest or the elders who were called to investigate, but actually imperial officials and soldiers. In other words, bureaucracy meets superstition. We Austrians have always been famous for two things: Wiener Schnitzel and bureaucracy. And honestly, I think the bureaucracy even wins. No, seriously, if there's a form to fill out or a stamp to smack down, if there's a report to file, I swear to God the Habsburger were on it. They could turn anything into paperwork. Tax collection, marriage, which goat belonged to which farmer, all neatly written up in triplicate. Fun fact, the Austrian army still worked like that with triplicates, I'd say like 10 years ago. It's only been recently that they kind of upped their game and modernized a little bit.
Nice.
You know, you're in Austria when even a vampire panic comes with paperwork. Peasants were digging up corpses and screaming, and the empire's response was basically, yes, fine, but could you sign here and here and initial the stake through the heart? Bitteschön, danke, auf Wiedersehen. At the same time, medicine was in this very awkward in-between stage. You know, doctors weren't talking about witches and curses anymore, but they also didn't understand things like germs and bacteria and how bodies actually decompose. So they were groping toward modern science, but they didn't quite have the tools and the knowledge just yet. Which is why a bloated corpse with blood at the mouth could look like, that could be a vampire.
Yeah, like a tick. Like a tick that just ate too much.
Feasting.
What a lovely image to conjure into your brain.
Petar Blagojević was, by all accounts, a very ordinary villager. and he died suddenly. Some sources say after a short illness, others don't give much explanation at all. His burial should have been the end of the story. But within 8 days of his death, things in Kisilova turned very weird. 9 other villagers died, all reportedly after brief illnesses, and many claimed on their deathbeds that Blagojević himself had come to them at night. He strangled them, they said, or pressed onto their chest until they suffocated. This detail, the suffocation, the life being drained, would become, of course, a hallmark of vampire lore. The most bizarre story came from his own widow. She swore that her late husband had appeared in their home after the burial. Ask her to return his shoes, please. Terrified, she fled the village and never came back. Understandably, the villagers were horrified. With 9 people dead in just over a week and eerie stories spreading, they turned to their priest and to the local Austrian official known as the Habsburg's commander. The villagers demanded that Blagojević's body be exhumed and examined. Now, this wasn't unusual for the time. In many parts of Eastern Europe, suspected vampires were dug up and checked for quote-unquote signs. But the difference here is that the Austrian official actually allowed it and then wrote a report about it. So the grave was opened, and the villagers, as well as the official, claimed they found something absolutely shocking. The official report stated that, quote, the body was completely whole and undecayed. His skin and hair had grown, his nails were fresh and new, blood was found in the mouth, described as fresh and red, end quote.
Okay, I mean, now we know that these are classic features of decomposition. The skin retracts, which makes the nails and hair look as if they're longer or maybe as if they even grew. Blood can seep from the mouth as the internal organs begin to break down. All of this is a normal part of decomposition, necessary as part of the life cycle, right?
Exactly, yeah, but imagine being a frightened villager in 1725, and of course, to these people, it was undeniable proof that Blagojević was walking from his grave to kill the living. And the villagers wasted no time. A sharpened stake was driven right through his heart. And the report notes with grisly details, quote, much blood flowed from his ears and mouth, end quote. And then his body was burned to ashes.
So this is kind of interesting, though, the fact that they claim that there was a lot of blood flowing out of him. But I guess it makes sense when you look at what happens during decomposition, because after death, blood doesn't circulate anymore. It settles and starts to break down inside the body. We all know this, right? But also, what happens is if you pierce the chest or abdomen, especially with violent force, those fluids can come rushing out of whatever orifice is available. It's all kind of awful and grisly to think about, but not nefarious in any way. But to a 1725 villager, that looks like fresh blood. They don't know the difference. They don't know livor mortis or internal gas pressure. They don't know any of this stuff. And so, I mean, I think long story short, let's just all remind ourselves not to go poking the recently deceased. Leave that to the professionals, you know?
That's true.
If we could just not.
Also, it reminds me of episode 1 of The Girlfriend, but again, another story.
Oh, I immediately was thinking of episode 1 of The Girlfriend as well. Also, I just keep thinking of this guy, this like very probably basic guy, you know, living his basic life during this really tricky time. He probably got, I don't know, cut himself and died of sepsis or got
splinter
a cold that turned into pneumonia and he died. But he's so famous now because everyone thinks that after he died, he became a vampire.
Isn't that crazy?
Wouldn't that be such a weird thing to be like known for?
But also kind of cool, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty badass.
So the Austrian official who witnessed this wrote everything down and then sent it up the chain of command. And here's an attempt at a translation. Of course, the original is in 18th century Austrian German. But here's what I came up with. Quote, About 10 weeks ago, a villager of Kisilova in the Rama district named Petar Blagojević died and was buried in the customary way. Since then, reports have spread in Kisilova that within the space of 8 days, 9 other people, both old and young, died after only 24 hours of illness. While still alive on their deathbeds, these people openly declared that the same Petar Blagojević, who had died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, had lain on them and strangled them so that they could not escape death. The surviving villagers were alarmed and their fears grew when Blagojević's widow swore that her husband had come to her as well and asked for his shoes. Terrified, she abandoned the village entirely, since it was believed that such people, whom they called vampires, could be recognized by certain signs, namely that their bodies remained undecayed and that hair, beard and nails continued to grow. The villagers resolved to open his grave and look for these signs. They came to me and requested that I, together with the local priest, attended the inspection. I refused at first, explaining that such matter had to be reported to the higher administration and await official orders. But the villagers flatly refused to wait. They told me I could do as I liked, but if I didn't allow them to proceed, they would abandon their homes, since they feared that until instructions could arrive from Belgrade, the entire village might be destroyed by this evil spirit, as they reminded me had already happened in Turkish times. Unable to dissuade them, I went with the priest of Gradiška to Kisilova and inspected the already exhumed body of Petar Blagojević. What I found was as follows. There was no odor at all from the body or the grave, as one would expect from the dead. Except for the nose, which had collapsed somewhat, the body was completely fresh. Hair and beard and even nails had grown, while the old ones had fallen away. The old skin, whitish in color, had peeled away, revealing new, fresh skin underneath. The face, hands, feet, and the entire body looked as complete as if the man were still alive. And in his mouth, I saw, to my astonishment, fresh blood, which the villagers claimed had been sucked from those he had killed. In sum, all the signs were present that such people, so-called vampires, were supposed to have. When the priest and I had seen this and the mob became more enraged rather than reassured, the villagers in haste sharpened the stake and drove it through the heart of the corpse. At this piercing, not only did much fresh blood flow from the ears and mouth, but other dreadful signs occurred, which I will not describe out of respect. Finally, they burned the body to ashes, as was the customary practice in such cases. I will now report this to the higher administration, and I beg that if any error has been committed, it should not be blamed on me, but on the villagers who were driven by fear beyond all reason. End quote.
Wow.
Any thoughts on this?
I mean, yeah.
I love how it's so matter of fact, and then, but also like it's none of this is my fault.
Like also,
don't blame me.
FYI, I'm just the messenger. Like, please. Wow.
Also, like the old skin was peeling away, and under it was new fresh skin.
So that's the thing I don't understand. Was there like an adipose wax situation going on?
I have no idea.
I want to talk to, oh, I'm blanking on her name, the Order of the Good Death, the mortician who does the videos about stuff. Because I bet she knows exactly what's going on. I suspect like an adipose grave wax
something like
situation,
that probably,
maybe.
Yeah.
But there's the point being that there's obviously a reasonable scientific explanation.
Has to be, of course. Yeah. Or maybe he just exaggerated.
Maybe.
Or he didn't really look closely because he was like squeamish. And
that's a good question because he says there was no smell.
Yeah. Also, what are the signs he doesn't want to talk about out of respect?
Oh.
What other things did they see?
That's a good question. I suspect it was more, I don't think it was more, I think the things they don't talk about out of respect was like, had it soiled the casket? Were there, do you know, things?
Something like that.
Yeah, that's probably my guess. But again, just a guess.
So, anyway, this report was printed in a Viennese newspaper, making Blagojević one of the very first vampires in European print culture. Readers across the empire were scandalized but also fascinated. Some dismissed it as peasant superstition, while others took it as very serious evidence that the dead could walk around and suck your blood. As I said, the word vampire entered the German language and quickly spread into other European languages, and for the people of Kisilova, the panic ended once the corpse was destroyed. For the wider world, though, this was just the beginning, because within a year, another, even more sensational vampire panic broke out in another Serbian village under Austrian rule. And this time, it wouldn't be 9 deaths, it would be dozens of deaths. It all started with a man named Arnold Paole. Now, his story is a little bit messier and bloodier, and it provided the foundation for almost every vampire trope we recognize today. Arnold Paole, which is sometimes spelled Arnold Paole, was a soldier who had served in the Habsburg army. And like many men on the military frontier, he had spent time abroad in regions still where vampire folklore was part of life. During his service, Paole claimed that he had been attacked by a vampire in Kosovo, which was most likely in modern-day Kosovo. According to later testimony, Paole told people he had protected himself by eating soil from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with the creature's blood, which is kind of a vampire antibiotic, I assume.
It reminds me of, this is such a trope in modern-day zombie stuff, isn't it?
The smearing of the blood,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. But also the soil from the vampire's grave, which is like vampire lore has it that they always have to have home soil with them when they travel.
I keep thinking of what we do in the shadows.
So, of course, this was a very dangerous thing to admit because Paole essentially confessed he had once been in contact with vampirism, which meant he was forever at risk of becoming one. So he then returned to his village of Medvegia in today's Serbia, and then he lived an ordinary life until he died suddenly around 1726. And accounts say it was an accident. He fell from a hay wagon and broke his neck. So he was buried, and again, this should have been the end of it. Spoiler alert, it was, in fact, not the end of it. Because within weeks, villagers started to claim that Paole had been seen wandering around at night. 4 people died soon after, allegedly visited by Paole before their deaths. Others said livestock were found mysteriously drained or mauled. The villagers were terrified, and they insisted that Paole's grave should be opened. And when his body was exhumed, the classic vampire signs were found once again. Body appeared intact, not decayed. Blood was found in his mouth. Nails and hair seemed to have grown. This was enough for the villagers. A stake was driven through his chest. Reports claimed the body groaned as the stake pierced it, a detail that would later become also a vampire cliché. And then his body was burned, and so were the bodies of the 4 villagers who had died after his attacks or reported attacks.
Oh man, you really have to be thorough though. You can't just let...
Have to be.
Yeah.
No.
Why risk it, really?
But again, this still wasn't the end. About 5 years later, or so around 1731, Medvegia experienced another wave of mysterious deaths. This time, over a dozen villagers died within weeks, and many more fell sick. Again, rumors of vampirism spread. People remembered Paole and suspected that he had probably infected others before they could perform a coronary bypass using the wooden stake. So what did they do? They called for an imperial contagions medicus by the name of Glaser, and he was brought in from a nearby town.
So an imperial contagions medicus, basically an expert on infections. Is that his contagious?
But isn't it a cool title? Imperial contagions medicus.
That's what I would, yes. I have a new aspiration in life.
So here is his report, because of course he wrote a report. Quote,
I love this.
From the village of Medved on the Morava, whose inhabitants complained of deaths, I, as the imperial physician, went to Parakin and from there to the village itself on December 12, 1731. I searched the village thoroughly, house by house, and examined the conditions, but found no sign of any contagious disease or epidemic, only tertian and quartan fevers, pleurisy, and chest complaints, all of which stemmed from privations endured during the recent fasting period. But when I inquired further as to why they complained that in 6 weeks 13 persons had died and what illness they had suffered before their death, they told me again of the same pains in the side and chest, long fevers, and aching of the limbs. Yet, they said, such rapid succession of burials could not possibly come from ordinary sickness. Rather, it must be because vampires, whom they also call bloodsuckers, were present. Together with their own officers, I tried to talk them out of this idea as much as possible, in the presence of the corporal from Kragobats. But it was impossible to dissuade them from their opinion. They said that before they would allow themselves to be killed in this way, they would rather move elsewhere. Already 2 or 3 households were gathering at night, some to sleep, others to keep watch, and they insisted the deaths would not stop until the authorities themselves ordered an execution against the named vampires. In the village, there had been during their lifetime 2 women who were said to have quote-unquote become vampires, and who after death were thought to be vampires in turn infecting others. These 2 women had died 7 weeks before, and the people held firmly to this belief, especially regarding one old woman named Milica, around 50 years old. Thank you very much. Dead for 7 weeks. She had come over from the Turkish side 6 years earlier, lived quietly in Medved, and was never suspected of anything diabolical. But she had once told her neighbors that in Turkey she had killed 2 sheep that vampires had attacked, and therefore, when she herself died, she too would become a vampire. On these words, the villagers firmly founded their opinion. I saw this person myself, considering her age and frail constitution, and that she had lain 7 weeks in the grave without a coffin, only in damp earth. She ought by now to have been half decayed. Instead, she lay with her mouth open, bright red blood flowing from nose and mouth, the body swollen and suffused with blood, which struck me myself as suspicious. And the villagers were not wrong to point out that when other graves were opened, of younger persons, stronger and fatter in life, who had died of milder illnesses and who had lain in the earth for shorter times, their bodies were properly decayed, unlike this old woman. The second woman was named Stana, about 20 years old, who had died in childbirth with the child also dead. In life, she had told her neighbors that while in Turkish lands, where vampires were very strong, she had smeared herself with vampire blood to protect herself, and therefore, after death, she would also become a vampire. Her corpse was found in much the same condition as the first, and so was the body of the child. Since the infant had not yet been baptized, it had not been buried in the cemetery, but behind a fence where the mother had lived, and I saw this too. The other corpses named by the villagers were likewise in suspicious conditions and had died in quick succession, believed to have been vampirized. Miloj, a boy of 14, dead 5 weeks. Joachim, a boy of 15, dead 5 weeks. The 2 had died 1 day apart. Ružica, a woman of 40, dead 15 days, half suspect. Petar, a child of 15 days, dead 5 weeks, very suspect. By contrast, others who were younger, stronger, and fresher in life were already properly decayed, as one would expect. Milošova, the wife of a Hajduk about 30, dead 3 weeks. Radi, a man of 24, dead 3 weeks. Vučica, a boy of 9, dead 1 month. Therefore, the people humbly beg that the honorable authorities issue an order for an execution against the named vampires to remove this evil. And in my opinion, it would be good to do so, to satisfy the subjects, since this is a rather large village and the matter is, in fact, as has been described. End quote.
There's a lot to unpack in that whole thing there, isn't there? Oh, I'm really glad that I personally think that your body is just the vessel that your soul uses when you're here, and then when you're gone, like, kind of who cares, really? Because otherwise, this would be upsetting stuff. Like, just the indignity that all of these bodies had to go through because of this suspected thing. And then this whole thing where I killed sheep who were infected by that's not how any of this works. That's not how everyone knows how vampirism works, and that's not it. I guess that was it. I guess the things have changed. I guess smearing the blood on it was enough. You didn't have to be bitten. Also, the other thing that really struck me from that is when they're just rambling off all the people that died within a few week period and just how many of them are fairly young or children.
Yeah. It's very sad.
It's very sad.
So the panic grew so severe that Austrian authorities sent in a formal investigative team led by a man named Johannes Flückinger, who was a regimental medical officer. And they conducted autopsies and wrote detailed reports. And Flückinger's report, titled Visum et Repertum, so Seen and Discovered, is one of the most famous vampire documents in history. It described in forensic, scientific for the time, detail the exhumation of 40 corpses. Now, 17 of the bodies were described as quote-unquote in a vampire state. These corpses were whole and undecayed with fresh blood in the chest and stomach. Some were said to have moved when staked. Villagers swore the corpses had been seen outside their graves at night, and the medical team concluded that vampirism was indeed real, or at least that the villagers believed it so strongly that drastic action was necessary. So they ordered the infected, or quote-unquote infected corpses, staked, decapitated, and burned. Flückinger's report was then sent to Vienna and then quickly published in pamphlets across Europe.
Yeah, so, wow. I can see how this would absolutely cause a vampire panic. Because so far, like prior to this, you mostly only had lore and gossip and rumor. But now these are official documents. They've been signed by doctors, officers of the Austrian army. Like this is like releasing Project Blue Book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, wow. What's the truth?
You're absolutely right. And that's basically why the case caused such a sensation. But not everybody took it serious. In Paris, for example, Voltaire mocked it. He wrote that it was absurd that in an age of reason, because remember that was when Enlightenment started, anyone could ever believe in such a nonsense or believe in the undead. But the fact that Austrian officials had treated it seriously gave the idea a legitimacy it never had before. The Paole case established many of the rules of vampirism that we now take for granted in folklore and fiction. So, vampires spread their condition like an infection. They attack both people and animals. Victims then themselves become vampires. And the cure, if you want to call it that, is staking, decapitation, and burning. So without Arnold Paole and the Austrian obsession with documenting his case, it's very unlikely Bram Stoker would have had such a rich tradition to draw on when he wrote Dracula 150 years later.
Yeah. Okay. And so the whole Habsburg Empire now was just like, yeah, vampires, definitely real. Turns out they're real. Who knew?
Who would have thought? Who knew? Well, here's the thing. As I said, by the mid-18th century, these vampire scares started to kind of make the Habsburg monarchy look a little bit ridiculous. And Maria Theresia of Austria was really not amused. She was trying to run a modern, centralized, enlightened state, and seriously, there's not much more that says backward like officials filing vampire reports. I think we can all agree on that.
Absolutely.
So Maria Theresia became ruler of the Habsburg Empire in 1740 when she was just 23 years old. And actually, she wasn't really supposed to. The Habsburg crown was usually passed from father to son, like most crowns, especially back in the day. But her father, Emperor Karl VI, didn't have any sons, just daughters. Well, actually, Maria Theresia did have an older brother, Leopold Johann, but he had passed away before he was even a year old. And because dynasties in the 18th century cared about male heirs more than competent rulers, Charles or Karl had spent years trying to secure a law called the Pragmatic Sanction. And it basically stated, okay, fine, if there's no son, then the eldest daughter gets to inherit everything. And he worked for years to get Europe's other powers to agree to it. So they all signed and smiled and nodded and they said, of course, anything you want, Charlie. No problem at all. And then Charles died. And everyone immediately broke their promise, which is classic, I think.
Ugh.
Within months, almost every neighbor of the Habsburgs smelled weakness. Frederick the Great of Prussia decided to invade Silesia, one of Austria's richest provinces, because why not, he could. Bavaria wanted land, France wanted land, Spain wanted, Saxony wanted, they all wanted like a piece of the cake. And even the smaller German states were circling like vultures. What followed was the War of the Austrian Succession, which sounds like some kind of royal soap opera, but was actually an all-out land grab at the Austrian expense. And so into this mess steps Maria Theresia, 23 years old, a young mother, absolutely inexperienced in government because nobody thought she's going to be on the throne, so we don't have to teach her anything.
No, girls don't need to learn anything.
No. And in the eyes of her rivals, she's totally out of her depth. She was supposed to be a pushover, a placeholder queen. They could bully her into giving up half of her empire. Spoiler alert, turns out she was not. Over the next 40 years, Maria Theresia would become one of the most formidable rulers of the 18th century. She modernized the empire's bureaucracy. Of course she did. She reformed the tax system so that nobles actually had to pay something for once. She centralized administration and built up a professional army. And she was also the one who introduced compulsory education in 1774, making basic schooling mandatory for children across her empire, all the children. She had 16 children, one of whom was Marie Antoinette. We just talked about her in the 2 episodes about the affair of the necklace. And basically, Maria Theresia managed to keep an empire together in an era when women weren't even supposed to rule. She also had no patience for superstition or disorder. Even though Maria Theresia, she was a devout Catholic, but she was also very practical. She wanted her empire to be orderly, efficient, and respectable in the eyes of Europe. And she definitely didn't want peasants running around digging up corpses or foreign philosophers making jokes about Austrians believing in vampires. So to her, superstition wasn't just silly, it was dangerous. It fueled unrest, it made her subjects harder to govern, and it really embarrassed the dynasty in a way. So it's not surprising that when the vampire panic became too much, Maria Theresia called in her most trusted physician, Gerard van Swieten, to deal with it. She didn't want mobs running wild with stakes and torches. She wanted a doctor's report that said, "This is nonsense. Stop it, people." And that's exactly what she got. And as I said before, van Swieten wasn't Austrian. He was Dutch. He had been trained at Leiden under the famous Hermann Boerhaave, and he'd been brought to Vienna in the 1740s to reform the imperial court's medicine. He was very smart, very stubborn, and a true doctor of the age of Enlightenment, or, as we call it in German, die Aufklärung. Meaning he believed in science, reason, observation, and definitely not superstition. And on top of that, Maria Theresia also made him the head of the court library, so he was one of the most widely read men in the whole empire. And when the vampire panic became too embarrassing to ignore, Maria Theresia ordered van Swieten to investigate. And unlike the terrified villagers or the army surgeons who dutifully wrote up what they saw, van Swieten approached it with a cool and very rational eye. He read reports from Blagojević and Paole, and he looked into the local customs, and then he wrote up his very own report explaining the phenomenon.
And what was his conclusion?
Well, according to van Swieten, there was nothing supernatural going on. He explained that the villagers were misinterpreting the normal stages of decomposition, as you just said before. A corpse might look fresh, or have blood at the mouth, or even appear to have grown hair and nails, but all of that, he argued, could be explained by natural causes. And, crucially, he said that the real danger was not vampires, the real danger was the spread of superstition itself. Maria Theresia in Vienna took his advice very seriously, and in the 1750s she issued an imperial decree banning the practice of exhuming bodies and staking them. And from then on, vampire hunts were officially outlawed in the Habsburg lands.
Let me guess, the villagers didn't just suddenly stop believing and stop staking corpses.
No, of course not. Folklore doesn't disappear with the stroke of a pen in a faraway city. But at least Austria stopped embarrassing itself with official vampire trials and reports and files and documents. And even when the empire banned vampire hunts, the idea of the undead kept creeping into medical debates. Instead of priests and villagers, it was now doctors and scientists asking, what if vampires were real? Or could it all be explained by disease? And suddenly every disease you can think of was being pitched as the real vampire condition. 4 of the most common ones are tuberculosis, rabies, porphyria, and premature burial. I'd say let's start with tuberculosis. And we talked about it so many times.
So many times.
So that's the reason why I won't get into too much detail here. Basically, in the 18th and 19th century, TB was called consumption, and it was called consumption for a good reason. People literally wasted away. They lost weight, they grew pale, they coughed up blood, and in families it often spread from one member to another, which to villagers could have looked like the classic pattern of vampirism. One person dies, and then the other one who lived in the same house start to fade away, as though the dead were draining their life. And you can imagine how terrifying that must have been. No germ theory yet, no antibiotics, just this kind of steady chain of death in one household and then spreading to the next and so on. So I think it was very easy for people to say, oh, clearly the dead are feeding on the living.
I think also that description is probably the closest in our lifetime we can get to with this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is just imagine how scared everybody was when COVID first started.
Oh,
and nobody was totally
Mm-hmm.
sure how it spread. Do you remember we were like wiping down groceries? We were, and people were getting sick in households. And those of us
or
who were
HIV in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Then we have rabies. This one is fascinating because rabies actually does mimic a lot of vampire traits. People infected with rabies can become very aggressive. They may bite. They are terrified of water.
Yeah. So-called hydrophobia is one of the hallmark symptoms of rabies. They're also hypersensitive to things like light, mirrors, and strong smells. Do I have rabies?
And does that sound familiar? Because it's basically the vampire starter kit. Rabies outbreaks often came from wolves or dogs, which also connects with the werewolf folklore, but in areas with vampire traditions, rabies made a need fit. Somebody gets bitten, they change, they spread it to others, and soon you have the whole village in panic. Porphyria is the classic modern scientific, and I'm making air quotations, scientific explanation. It's a little bit of a stretch though.
Porphyrias are a group of rare genetic blood disorders that affect how your body produces heme. I think it's heme, Heme, and it's part of hemoglobin. Some types of porphyria can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, leading to blistering and scarring when exposed. In very severe cases, people will avoid daylight, which lines up neatly with the idea of vampires shunning the sun. Porphyria can also cause discolored teeth, reddish-brown urine, and in some descriptions, a craving for blood, or at least for iron. In the 20th century, some writers got very excited about porphyria as being the quote-unquote vampire disease. But in reality, it's really rare and it doesn't explain mass panics. Still, it's definitely one of those medical curiosities that keep popping up in vampire documentaries.
Then there's also another theory that gained traction more recently. Now I talked about the Austrian forensic pathologist and medical historian, Professor Dr. Christian Reiter. I mentioned him in our Elfriede Blaunsteiner episode. He has argued that the vampire panic of 1731 to 1732 in Medvegia was in fact an anthrax outbreak. Yeah. The same disease you probably associate with scary white powder in envelopes. Do you all remember that time?
Mm-hmm.
So back in the 18th century, anthrax wasn't a lab biohazard. It was a natural livestock disease. And it could spread quickly in rural farming communities like, those on the Habsburg military frontier. The outbreaks in Serbia in 1725 and then again in 1731 happened in exactly the kind of conditions where anthrax thrives. Villages were poor, sanitation was minimal, and people lived in very close contact with their animals. So if cattle or sheep were infected, it could jump to humans through contaminated meat or hides. Today we know the culprit. It's the Bacillus anthracis identified by Robert Koch in the late 19th century. But of course, in the 1730s, no one had a clue what was even happening. All they saw were symptoms that looked terrifyingly like vampire attacks. Victims developed sudden high fevers, struggled with unquenchable thirst, and in some forms of the disease like cutaneous anthrax developed dark bluish-red blotches on their skin. And some of these marks appeared on the chest and neck, right over the collarbones, which would very easily be interpreted as vampire bite marks or bruises left by a suffocating corpse. Not the suffocating corpses.
Not the suffocating corpse.
Other forms of anthrax affected the lungs or intestines, leading to bloody discharge, rapid decline, and death within days. So in a world without antibiotics, this was a death sentence, basically.
And a lousy one.
Yeah.
Not a good death.
No. And now think about what it looked like to the villagers. Perfectly healthy neighbors one day suddenly collapsed with fevers, coughed up blood, or showed strange blotches near the throat, and then they died quickly, often within a day or two. And then, just as with tuberculosis, it spread through families, which made it seem like this chain reaction of supernatural attacks. And the timing fits too. Anthrax can spread in waves depending on exposure to infected animals. So you could easily have multiple deaths in a very quick succession.
You can also get it from the soil, can't you?
I guess, and also from the milk you're drinking, right?
That's it. So, like, there are so many, if there's an anthrax outbreak in an area, like, yikes. And it could look different in different people, depending on how. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
And then finally, this for some people is the most chillingly simple explanation: premature burial. In the days before modern medicine, it wasn't always easy to tell if someone was truly dead. You know, there were comas, seizures, or just very shallow breathing, and people would think, okay, this person expired.
That's right. I mean, that still happens today. It's rare, thank dog, but it still happens today. But yeah, the being buried alive, there are lots of records of people being buried alive only to wake up in their coffins, scratching at the wood until they suffocated. We discussed it in a couple of episodes at least.
Yeah, and so later when those graves were opened, villagers found bodies with torn fingernails or blood around the mouth or twisted expression. Also, there's this part where they find bodies on their stomach. You know, now there are two explanations for that. It could either be if you're buried alive and you want to push up the lid of the coffin, maybe your instinct is to turn around and kind of try to push it open with your back and suffocate like this. But also we have to be aware that sometimes if somebody was a suspected vampire, they would bury them face down.
So that they would dig in their own directions. To
confuse them. Yeah.
Yep.
So easy to confuse vampires.
The important thing is to make sure they don't understand which way they're digging. And they'll just keep digging. That's definitely how it works.
Probably they also didn't know this kind of thing that you learn when you're trapped in after avalanche. To pick up some snow and let it fall down, and then you know which way is up and which way is down.
That's right.
Torn fingernails, all these signs were definitely just signs of terror from someone who was buried too soon and woke up and was like, what the fuck, what's going on?
It's terrifying. It is terrifying. I think we can all, that is a universal fear, isn't it?
Yeah. And the fear of premature burial was so strong in the 18th and 19th century, they came up with a lot of things like safety coffins equipped with bells and flags or air tubes, just in case you weren't so dead after all. Now, of course, none of these diseases on their own account for every vampire story, but I think each one gives us a glimpse into how very real human suffering could morph into the tales of the undead. It's also very important to consider we can now laugh about all these stupid superstitious villagers, but in reality, they were observing something very real to them. People wasting away, sudden outbreaks of aggression, and then corpses that didn't look properly dead.
That's right.
What would we have thought? Just exactly the same thing.
Exactly the same thing. Yes, absolutely. Especially because when we talk about the grave being buried alive stuff, it's like, oh gosh, this terrible thing that used to happen, but it really did used to happen. So it's different when it's somebody it's wild. And without any kind of modern science, vampires is the best explanation they had. Like,
definitely.
Yeah, it's easy to laugh at them, but I think we'd all be a bit panicked as well in their situation.
And here's a last little bit of trivia for you, all out there listening. This is really great. This is the best thing. So, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, I'm so proud of my country.
You should be.
Austria still holds the record for the largest vampire epidemic in history. Because between 1725 and the 1750s, there were about 30 documented exhumations and vampire executions. Probably there were hundreds more that were not documented, that were done like, okay, you outlawed exhuming vampires and staking them. We're just doing it on the down low.
That's right. Wow.
That's it.
That really is a vampire panic story.
Yeah.
It's so interesting, though, isn't it?
It's wild to think about. Like, you have these official reports and then they spread all over Europe. And then 150 years later, some Irish author is like, okay, let's write a book about a country I never visited.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
Do you have something good?
The vampire myth, I guess. I've just enjoyed so many, like, from this has sprung all these books that we've been able to read over the years, all the different takes on the vampire and what the vampire is. It's always been like the most appealing. Like if something was real, that's the one I'd almost hope was real, but only specific versions of it, obviously.
Yeah. Not the super scary, gross ones, like the sexy ones.
I like the idea of healing from anything and not being in constant pain anymore. Not gonna lie, that's a very appealing scenario for me. Dislike the idea of living forever.
Yeah.
That would be terrible. I couldn't handle that much loss.
I mean, you can still walk into the sunlight if you just wanted to be over with it.
As long as that's an option, then I'm in. Yeah, I like the vampire. So, yeah.
I like it too.
Yeah. How about you?
My something good has something kind of to do with the episode. You know it already. Last week, I went to the pre-premiere. I didn't even know that's a thing, basically, that you can buy tickets for a pre-premiere of the newest musical in Vienna. We have a very active musical scene here in Vienna, and very great musicals came from Vienna and were composed and world premiered here, like Elisabeth or Mozart or the Falco musical, which I've watched 5 or 6 times. I don't even remember. Things like that. And now the newest one is the premiere tonight, but I went there last week. It's about Maria Theresia. And I was not expecting a lot because I heard it has this kind of like Hamilton, a little bit this rap, hip hop, parkour thing, which is usually not something I'm into in musicals. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to see it because I got a really cheap ticket for 15 euros, which was like, oh my God, that's just...
How are you not going to go? For that price?
And the actor who played Falco in the Falco musical plays Frederick the Great of Prussia. And so I was like, I love that guy. Like, I'm obsessed with him as an actor, as a musical actor.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, I'm going to watch it. And the first 20 minutes, I was like, I'm really not too much into it. And then Frederick of Prussia appears, and from then on, it gets really good. And now, for a week now, I've been thinking about it constantly, and I'm definitely going to rewatch it. And it's the whole story of how Empress Maria Theresia, gets on the throne, and everybody just starts war. And yeah, it's great. Great.
You sent me the clips. That guy can sing, and he looks nice doing it.
It's great, right?
Yeah. He is easy on the ears and the eyes. The whole aesthetic.
Yes,
I'm here for
much.
it. Mm-hmm. We're fans, both.
All right. I think that's it.
Vampires.
The vampires. We really hope, and I really hope, because I'm always kind of nervous when I tell Austrian stories, so I really hope you enjoyed it.
We love the Austrian stories. You have to stop worrying about that.
If you did enjoy it, please take a second to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen. It really, really helps other people find us, and we appreciate it more than you could ever know.
That's right. You can also follow us on Spotify and on YouTube, and in both of those platforms, you can leave us comments, and we love hearing from you. Thank you.
And for more Fresh Hell, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com. Search for Fresh Hell Podcast. As we said before, patrons get early access, bonus content, Cinema Macabre, live streams, the live get-togethers, a little bit of behind the scenes, a little bit of more private videos, and that sounds like we're not that private. You know what I'm talking about. Our patrons are just the best spooky international family you could ever hope for.
They really are. Really. And don't forget our Facebook group where you can hang out with the other Hellions, swap stories, share what's going on in your corner of the world.
And you can also visit our website, freshhellpodcast.com, for show notes, links, and more. And if you'd like to send us your own spooky tale, you can email us at freshhellpodcast@gmail.com.